The Swan River Colony began its existence as an avowed free colony in 1829, but within a short time many of the new settlers were experiencing extreme difficulties. Many enterprises quite quickly began to fail. Part of the responsibility for the difficulties encountered by the early settlers could be attributed to Captain James Stirling. He had explored the Swan River early in 1827 and realised the potential for another British settlement, for its agricultural potential and as a bulwark against possible French expansion in the region. He wrote a glowing report for Governor Darling in New South Wales, who in turn recommended it to the government in England. Stirling's report, however, proved superficial and did not sufficiently countenance the contrasting conditions within a very different, often hostile landscape, away from the rich soils of the immediate Swan River floodplain. The British government initially showed little interest, but Stirling, undeterred and still enthusiastic, petitioned for a private enterprise venture to be founded at the Swan River. Somewhat reluctantly, the British government finally acceded to the initiative and lent its support. Stirling was appointed the Lieutenant Governor, and the first group of settlers arrived off Fremantle aboard the Parmelia early in June 1829. Archdeacon Matthew Hale, later the first Bishop of Perth, toured the Swan River Colony region in 1848. He had first arrived in Australia in 1846 to take up a post as assistant to the Bishop of Adelaide. The Swan River Colony at that time was part of the Adelaide Bishopric, and so on an inspection tour Hale examined the conditions early West Australian settlers were encountering. He was appalled. He described them in the early section of this small 1857 publication on the transportation question, which was ostensibly on the convict system, of which he was extremely critical, but initially explained the reasons why the settlers were experiencing so many problems. He wrote of the hostile landscape and weather conditions so different from the native Britain, of the unsuitability of the type of settler who had taken up land, many of them sponsored by well-to-do families back in England. They were unused to personally hard, unremitting labour, and therefore lacking the basic skills required to work their new enterprises. Of the system of land allocation by purchase, precluding the more humble type of settler, those with the necessary physical skills, though without monetary resources. Of the lack of essential infrastructure development, roads, bridges and harbours. And so, with their enterprises failing, many of the settlers had to survive in unaccustomed stringent circumstances, or they left the colony. One diary of the conditions encountered was kept by Dr. Samuel Vivish, who, along with his brother, workers and their families, had arrived at the Swan River in 1839 and shortly after purchased Yanjadine, a property of 11,000 acres around halfway between York and Beverley. Like many others, Vivish brought with him from the old country a strongly ingrained mixed farming mentality, that is, horse, sheep, cattle, pig and poultry husbandry. They also brought a wide array of seeds for crops, vegetable and fruit produce, unsuited to the strange new agricultural environment, to the very different landscape and soils. The diary records the wide array of problems he faced on the property over the next 2 years. He wrote of the lack of fencing in the days before wire to contain stock, necessitating skilled shepherds, many of whom soon left for less demanding environments or began to demand higher wages. Of the critical lack of water for his animals, of the lack of infrastructure development, few roads, bridges, jetties, which would facilitate the essential flow of commerce, of the wide array of poison plants and the stock diseases encountered, resulting in considerable stock losses, of bushfires and dust and flies, of personal health problems, such as the constant debilitation of colonial ophthalmia, more commonly known as sandy blight, of extreme shortages of many basic items, such as tools and equipment which, should they break or become inoperable, were either overly expensive to replace or unprocurable. Defeated by the difficulties, Vivish left the property after only 2 years and took up a government post as a resident magistrate at Guildford. Today the nearby suburb of Vivish is named after him. His early catalogue of despair at the Yanjadine property portrays the conditions under which most early farming enterprises in the foundling colony were operating. Many of the men on the Governor's Advisory Council, though holding government positions, such as the Surveyor General John Septimus Roe, were also landholders. Their enterprises too had suffered from a lack of essential labour. In 1848 they were instrumental in persuading Governor Fitzgerald to petition the British government for a trial complement of convicts to be sent to the Swan River in an attempt to ease a situation where the colony seemed on the point of disintegration. The upshot of these negotiations was that the Swan River colony, founded as a free settlement, celebrated its 21st birthday with the arrival of the first boatload of 75 convicts off Fremantle aboard the transport Scindian on the 1st of June 1850. Contrary to popular opinion, these first contingents of convicts were mostly from the rural regions of Britain, where a widespread agricultural depression had devastated many. The story of the Tolpuddle martyrs exemplified the poverty of many in the countryside, their attempts to improve their situations, and the callous way they were treated by those in positions of power and authority. In 1834 they had been arraigned on trial for mutinous behaviour, after having collectively asked for better wages and conditions. George Lovelace, their spokesman, said, "We were uniting to preserve ourselves, our wives and our children from starvation and utter degradation." For their pains they were found guilty and sentenced to transportation. The primitive conditions in the mines and factories in Britain, too, added to the misery of the working classes. This graphic is of a 9-year-old boy working in the narrow shafts of a Welsh coal mine. Children were used as an economy. The drives or shafts did not have to be so large to accommodate the smaller bodies. Progressively, the population began to move into the industrially expanding cities. The overcrowding brought disease and destitution, and with them an increase in the crime rate. It is recorded that only 1 child in 5 reached the age of 6 years in London during that period. Diseases such as typhus, typhoid, malaria, smallpox, tuberculosis and many others were rampant. The average age at death for a male in 1850 Britain was 39 years. But what of this convict transportation system? It had in fact been in existence for over 250 years before the first convict was sent to Western Australia. The Elizabethan era is sometimes described as the Golden Age in British history. The reality, however, was that many within the population were starving and destitute. For most, it was a desperate struggle for existence. In consequence, it was dangerous for citizens to walk the streets of the cities or ride through the countryside unprotected. In desperation at this disorder, the English Parliament passed an act making it legal to transport the burgeoning population of lawbreakers across the Atlantic Ocean to the east coast of America and the West Indies. Out of sight, out of mind. Little thought seems to have been given to the root cause of the social problems within the country by the legislators. For close on 175 years, therefore, between 30 to 50,000 convicts were transported to America from Britain. It proved to be a major source of aggravation for the American colonists, one of the contributory factors which eventually led to the American War of Independence. Note, in particular, Benjamin Franklin's unique suggestion. Following the American War of Independence, the primitive jails of England began to overflow again. The facility to readily rid itself of its overabundance of malefactors was now denied the British authorities. Hundreds of prisoners milled about in crowded courtyards in appalling conditions. It is thought many learn more about crime in jail than out of it. A better prison system was required. Philosopher and jurist Jeremy Bentham proposed a panopticon design, whereby each individual prisoner was placed in a separate cell away from the negative influences of other prisoners, and where each would undergo some skills training. The new approach had a religious base to it. The word cell is derived from the monastery tradition. The words penitent and penitentiary are derived from the Latin penitus, meaning deep inside, each prisoner being encouraged to reflect in solitude on the error of their ways and be repentant. Pentonville Prison, a panopticon, was opened in London in 1842. Those incarcerated there were thought to be the most capable of rehabilitation. The separate confinement period was, initially, to be 18 months. Each prisoner was to be afforded 1 hour of exercise per day, which was carried out in the external circular and oval courtyards one can see in this graphic of Pentonville Prison. During the exercise period, each prisoner grasped a knot in the rope. Each knot was around 5 yards apart. Each wore a mask so that he could not identify another prisoner. No talking or communication was permitted. Even in chapel on Sunday, the prisoners were partitioned off from one another. If one goes to Port Arthur in Tasmania, one can view such a chapel as this in the separate confinement prison that has been faithfully recreated there. Oscar Wilde was one notable who spent time in a separate confinement prison, Reading Gaol. His sentiments, expressed in his work The Ballad of Reading Gaol, are illuminating. Outside the day may be blue and gold, but the light that creeps through the thickly muffled glass of the small iron-barred window beneath which one sits is grey and niggard. It is always twilight in one's cell, as it is always midnight in one's heart. After having endured a period in separate confinement, which by 1848 had been reduced to 12 months from 18 months, and thereafter it was progressively reduced again because of the psychological trauma suffered by many, the prisoner was then moved on to the second stage of his sentence. He was placed into a government work party, usually at one of the crucial naval facilities at Woolwich, Chatham, Portsmouth or Plymouth, and accommodated in a hulk, a former naval vessel that had been decommissioned and stripped of its rigging and superfluous gear, and moored in mudflats and stagnant water byways. Living conditions were horrendous. Amongst the rats, cockroaches, fleas and filth, diseases such as typhus, typhoid and influenza were rife. This sketch is of a group of convicts scraping shot for the naval guns at Woolwich. They did this for 10 hours a day in summer before being returned to their rudimentary quarters aboard one of the hulks, where prisoners were accommodated 'tween decks en masse. It was overcrowded and foul odours permeated through the ship. 2 men shared one rug and a 50 centimetre by 180 centimetre bed space. Despite regulations, few washed or shaved, and clothing was of poor quality and fell apart quickly. In winter-time, when they worked only 7 hours in the open, they were battened down in their filthy quarters aboard the hulks for 15 or so hours. it was an existence of inconceivable misery. For those interested in naval history, the museum at Chatham, an easy train trip from London, would be an enlightening visit. But it is sobering to think that the large naval basin adjacent, where tall ships are still anchored, was excavated by hand by convict labour in the 1850s and 60s. However, there did exist a dim light at the end of the tunnel. Each prisoner wore a badge on his coat, on which was recorded his sentence, the top numeral, his behaviour category, the central figures, for example, very good, and the time he had served in months, the bottom numeral. One can see that the lower badge has the prisoner with only a 4-year sentence, but his behaviour category, G, good, is not quite as acceptable as with the top badge, VG, very good. These badges were important. It placed the responsibility for progression to the third stage of a prisoner's imprisonment, that is, transportation to the colonies, in his own hands. And progression to this third stage was often sought, the chance to escape the oppressive, debilitating regimens of stringent confinement within the British penal system of the time. Much of the credit for the institution of this marked system of positive progression through the system can be credited to this man, Alexander Maconochie. Maconochie first arrived in Van Diemen's Land with John Franklin's entourage in January 1837. He subsequently wrote a report on the state of prison discipline in Van Diemen's Land. It was published as a parliamentary paper and used by the 1837 Molesworth Committee investigation into the transportation system. Maconochie saw the paradox of punishment for past offences, supposing to improve a prisoner's future conduct. His remedy was to separate the two. He thought prisoners should be punished for the past, but at the same time trained for the future via a staged treatment process, including the mark system for good behaviour, which should engender the frame of mind of finally feeling tolerably free. He advocated change, and in consequence the system was modified. He proved to be a pioneer in penal reform and, as such, suffered the inevitable slings and arrows of criticism. But his concepts and many of his practical measures are now the basis of modern Western penal systems. When the time came for the transportation of convicts to Western Australia in 1850, similar humanitarian methods were adopted. It reflected a more enlightened humanitarian approach. This is a sketch of the Coromandel convict hulk at Island Island, a large British naval station in Bermuda. After a considerable outcry, the hulks had been abandoned in Britain in 1857. But it was forgotten they were still in use at the crucial Bermuda naval station for another 5 years. Many convicts died in that time, mainly of yellow fever in the tropical climate. Some of the last Bermudan convicts, 191 in all, were then sent to Western Australia aboard the transport Merchantman in 1863. The arrival of the Merchantman contingent of Bermudan convicts in February 1863 then brought the number of convict arrivals into Western Australia to a little over 7,000. In all, 43 transport ships brought a little over 9,500 convicts to Western Australia between June 1850 and January 1868. 6 of those ships had only a handful of convicts, mainly military prisoners from India who had been tried by court-martial for service misdemeanours. The remaining 37 ships contained convict complements of 200 to 300 from British ports. Only 43 deaths in all were recorded, an average of 1 per voyage, a gratifying statistic when compared to earlier voyages to New South Wales. Much of the credit must be attributed to early New South Wales convict William Redman, a medical doctor, who prepared a report on conditions aboard the early convict transports, which eventually resulted in an 1850s Act of Parliament at Westminster, specifying strict health and supervisory standards aboard these vessels. Recipients of these improvements were the later West Australian convicts in the 1850s and 60s. And so, the first contingent of 75 convicts arrived aboard the Scindian at Fremantle on the 1st of June 1850. They were put to work immediately on essential roadworks, or were sent to farms where their labour was sorely needed. It would be some time before Fremantle Prison, known as the Establishment, was completed. The initial plans, sent to the Colonial Office in London by the first Comptroller General of Convicts E.Y.W. Henderson, based on the Pentonville separate confinement model, were rejected. Modified plans were adopted, the authorities specifying that, in the main, the Fremantle establishment should be merely a transition facility for convicts before they progressed on to external work situations. The small size of each cell attests to that policy. The convicts, in the main, were to just sleep there overnight before moving on. The popular image of widespread chain gangs within the West Australian convict era is misleading. Only a small group of recalcitrants, or repeat offenders, ever existed within the state, although they were put to special project tasks. They were involved in the construction of the first bridge across the Swan River at Fremantle in 1866, and usually on other tasks not far from Fremantle Prison. Progressively, convict hiring depots were set up in the various locations throughout the settled regions. A convict, after being granted his ticket of leave, and in the early years in particular, this was in a relatively short space of time, remembering each convict had already served around half of his sentence in Britain prior to his arrival in the colony, was sent to a hiring depot, and there he could negotiate a position and terms of employment with a prospective employer. Archaeologist Martin Gibbs reports there were 22 of these depots at one point, from the Mount Eliza depot adjacent to the Swanbury site, servicing the Perth area, to Geraldton and Albany, and points in between, including Guildford, York and Toojay. It can't be emphasised too much that the autonomy of being able to determine his own workplace and conditions while negotiating with a prospective employer would have been a revelation to the convict after the oppressive, often brutal incarcerations he had endured for some years previously. The extreme labour shortages in the colony would have ensured a degree of personal bargaining power. In the first 4 years of the convict system in Western Australia, the insertion of these men into the colonial society went relatively smoothly. The statistical graphic here, however, shows a dramatic change from 1854 onward. The type of convict arriving changed, and the potential for compromising the good order of the quiet, peaceful society rose alarmingly. Aboard the first 7 transports, containing around 2,500 convicts in all, the rate of violent crime convictions ran at around 4%. Thereafter, it rose dramatically. Additionally, the incidence of life sentences among the arriving convicts also increased. If one adds together the violent crime convicts to those with life sentences, and also adds the repeat offenders aboard many of the ships, the outlook for the good order and stability of the Swan River colony was not promising from that time onward. So, what had happened to the original agreement with the British government at the outset, whereby promises had been made to send only convicts with relatively good character and capable of rehabilitation. In August 1853, the British government passed the Penal Servitude Act. In it they specified that those with relatively minor misdemeanours and consequent light sentences would now serve their time at home in Britain, which meant, of course, that if the Western Australian settlers wished to continue to receive convicts, they would have to take the more serious offenders. Why was this act passed? The Great Exhibition at Crystal Palace in 1851 heralded in what has become known as the Second Industrial Revolution. In consequence, the world beat a path to the door of British industry. Employment rose in the country, and in consequence, the crime rate dropped. No longer was cheap labour available in the required numbers from the prisons to build and maintain the harbour facilities, both mercantile and naval, for the largest fleets in the world at that time. So the passing of the 1853 Penal Servitude Act meant that the British would keep their better criminals at home to service their own commercial needs, thereafter designating only longer-term offenders for Western Australia. It was a case of like it or lump it, which had the potential to visit upon the struggling colony a social disaster to add to their economic woes. The fact is, however, that despite all the reasons why the new arrivals after 1854 should have compromised the good order of the infant society, it did not. Take note of the incidences of recalcitrant behaviour, or reoffending rates, of the Nile and the Merchantman, two of the most notorious ships. It was a similar story for many of the other convict ships, as shown here in the first portion of text, from the first ship Scindian in 1850 to the penultimate arrival Norwood in 1867. Then take special note of the second piece of text, the convict shipping and description lists 1850 to 1886, the year the British government relinquished control of the Fremantle establishment. Only 6.2% of the convict arrivals into the colony were sent back to the prison for serious offences over that 36-year period. Remarkable when compared against the 2010 figure of 52.6% for reoffending, for a similar array of offences within Australia. Which raises the question, why was it that the convict arrivals, with the potential to create the same problems in the colony they had done in Britain, did not do so? Firstly, the landscape. The new arrivals had not the same opportunities in the colony for former mischievous assembly. They were distributed widely, often in isolation from one another over considerable areas. In Tasmania, an average of around 1,000 a year had arrived and were inserted into a relatively small area with a more amenable capacity for intensive farming. Individual properties could employ over 20 convicts. It was not so in Western Australia, with only an average of 500 convicts arriving every year in a far less productive widespread farming landscape. Convict employment in numbers was a rarity. Close supervision by the authorities was ever present. A ticket of leave convict could have his freedom revoked immediately if he misbehaved. Everyday conditions were better for most than they had experienced in the old country. 3 meals a day, a roof over the head, and clothing supplied, at least initially. There was a reformation rather than retribution attitude towards them from many in the community, notably the Anglican Bishop of Perth, Matthew Hale. The attitude towards him by the settlers, who were very short of labour, was positive. The Burgess brothers of York are an example, and others assisted some of them to start their own farming and business enterprises once they gained their tickets of leave and proved their capabilities. Their relative autonomy and freedoms and opportunities in the new environment gave many the incentives to make fresh starts in life. The environmental influences were profound too. there was a noted deactivation of negative social habits that had formed during their former lives in Britain, especially within the burgeoning industrial cities, exampled in Charles Dickens' The Tale of Oliver and The Artful Dodger. There is scientific evidence that vastly different landscapes engender contrasting sensory responses. There are few more differing landscapes than those between the green, lush fields of England, or the grime and pallor of the industrial cities, against the stark open country of farming Western Australia. The capacity for marked personal change, given a vastly different environment, is a feature of Homo sapiens. The Western Australian colonial era is a profound case in point. With a new environment, new opportunities, and some encouragement, many convicts began to transition their lives in more positive directions. The arrival of a new governor, John Hampden, in 1862 heralded in a new phase in convict administration in Western Australia. During the 1850s, the accent had been in distributing convict labour among the free settler communities, mainly toward agricultural enterprises. With Hampden's arrival, that was to change. The British government, still the major investor in the colony, activated a building of infrastructure programs, roads, bridges, jetties, to better facilitate the commercial potential of the colony. Governor Hampden was appointed to carry out those new policies. Hampden, a former Controller General of Convicts in Tasmania, was to prove an efficient and effective administrator. He was not, however, to prove popular within the Western Australian community. The farming settlers, still requiring liberal supplies of labour, were aggrieved that their supply had been diminished. The editor of the Perth Gazette, Arthur Shenton, was offended by the gruff personality of the new governor, a severe administrator and man of few social graces. The Bishop of Perth, Matthew Hale, an influential figure with a predominantly Anglican community and an avowed opponent of the convict system, also fell out with Governor Hampden. The convicts who arrived during Hampden's tenure in the 1860s were also aggrieved. No longer were tickets of leave awarded after short periods of time, as they had been during the 1850s. Many now found themselves employed on government work parties, building roads and bridges, often for up to 4 years, before being able to apply for a ticket of leave. Governor Hampden, in consequence, has acquired a very negative reputation within the history of early Western Australian colony, overall quite unfairly. His influence during that period was a positive one, and in many ways turned the fortunes of the colony around. These figures display some basic points about the effects on the colony of the insertion of an alien, unwanted body of men who had left their home country, often unwillingly, for the good of another community on the far side of the world. The population of the state rose by nearly 5 times during the convict era. The British government had been true to its word. It had sent out a comparable number of free settlers to convicts between 1850 and 1868. By the early 1870s, when there were still over 3,000 convicts under government control in Western Australia, exports had risen to around 15 times what they had been in the early 1850s. The severe labour shortages within the struggling colony meant that the convicts were treated relatively well by the free colonists. It was in their interests to do so. It proved to be the basis of a closing of the social gap, a far cry from the divisions within British society. This, one of the major prominences of our relative egalitaire or social equality within modern Australian society today. The downside was that the British government, still the major investor in the life of the colony in the immediate post-convict era, and aided by the more conservative free settlers, denied the colony, where for a time the ex-convict fraternity outnumbered the free male workers, the granting of self-government, until the passing of the Enabling Bill through Westminster much later in 1889. What then eventually happened to the 9,500 convicts who came to Western Australia between June 1850 and January 1868? The life expectancy of a male who had been born in the 1820s, the 30s or 40s in Britain was 39.2 years. In contrast, statistics affirm that the convicts born in Britain during that time, but who'd come to the Swan River Colony, lived, on average, to the age of 58.2 years. That is, they lived 19 years longer in the new environment. Though 27% of the convict arrivals were recorded as having been married or widowed before departure from Britain, very few family reunions subsequently took place in the colony. Historian Rika Eriksson was of the opinion that only 1,000 marriages of convicts took place within the colony, which of course meant that 8,500 did not marry within the colony. Allowing for the fact that it is thought an approximate 2,000 left the colony at some stage, that still leaves 6,500 former convicts who did not marry within the colony. However, common law marriages or partnerships were quite common in those days, and so the social tragedy suggested by those figures might not have been so profound. Nevertheless, pockets of former convicts such as these three, pictured outside the Castle Hotel in York in 1900, did exist in small communities throughout the state, living a subsistence existence, then dying out gradually in towns like York or Toodyay or Northam, or at the Knoll in Fremantle, or at the old People's Home below Mount Eliza near the Swan Brewery, the former convict hiring depot that served the Perth labour market during the convict transportation era. With the gold rush to centres such as Coolgardie and Kalgoorlie in the 1890s, bringing with it a burgeoning of the state's population from New South Wales and Victoria in the main, the population grew around fourfold and society in Western Australia was transformed by the influx. The earlier times of struggle and division rapidly faded, and the new society, knowing little of those former years, paid little heed to what had gone before. And so it remains today, apart from a vestige or a residue of those former times of economic desperation and then general recovery. We still have remaining a variety of buildings that remind us of that time. The convict-built Perth Town Hall, Fremantle Prison, Government House, Barracks Arch, and other lesser-known buildings such as the York Roman Catholic Church, which, despite the National Trust plaque at the gate telling us otherwise, was built by Irish Fenian convict Joseph Noonan. There are 4 state premiers and a deputy premier who are convict descendants, as well as many other prominent citizens, such as a former captain of an All-Australian AFL side. And every year on WA Day, descendants of convicts and pensioner guards are presented with authenticated certificates within the walls of Fremantle Jail. The number of certificates issued is now approaching 3,000. If one undertakes a heritage walk through Fremantle Cemetery, you will be shown the gravesite of Western Australia's best-known convict, number 1790, Joseph Bolitho Johns, better known as Moondine Joe, who for a time during the 1860s was used by conservative elements within the colony as a political tool with which to vilify the unpopular but effective Governor Hampton. However, the question might be asked, does any of this matter now? The Western Australian convict era was long ago, and there's been much water under the bridge since. But at the time when the Swan River colony was on the point of disintegration in the 1840s, the introduction of convict labour into the struggling enterprises of the desperate colonists stabilised their economic fortunes and laid platforms for viable futures. And when these miscreants and misfits from Britain were given new opportunities, many transformed themselves into effective and productive citizens. English parliamentarian Daniel Hannan, after observing Australia and Australians in 2014, remarked, "Personal freedom, free contract capitalism, the common law are things people want to buy into. Australians took these characteristics much further. Any visitor to Australia is struck by the endurance of these characteristics, along with informality, bloody-mindedness, individualism and self-reliance. John Stuart Mill's libertarian philosophy made flesh." It is arguable that these national Australian characteristics had their beginnings when the first convicts gained pardons and began their first farming ventures and business enterprises over 200 years ago. The convict era, therefore, is at the core of an understanding of not only our early history, but provides an insight into who we are in the modern world today. For those interested in examining the Western Australian convict era further, these are resources which may be useful. The Fremantle Prison website, go to the link History and then to the convict databases, which give details of the convict ships and the individual convicts that were transported in them. The book Lags, A History of the Western Australian Convict Phenomenon, gives a comprehensive view of the British convict transportation system, which existed for over 270 years, from the latter years of the 16th century through to the mid-1870s. The book is available at the Fremantle Prison Bookshop, at the Royal Western Australian Historical Society in Nedlands, at the Alexander Library Bookshop in Perth, the Western Australian Genealogical Society, or at the 2J and York Tourist Centres. The website listed is of a PhD thesis entitled "The Convict Era in Western Australia, Its Economic, Social and Political Consequences," which provides a more detailed and analytical appraisal of the Australian convict period with special reference to the Western Australian system.